Whenever we contact an object through one of the senses, it sets in chain a whole series of processes. Processing of sense contact can be quite complex. And it's part of the delusion or bewilderment beings find themselves in, is that we don't see clearly what's happening. We're caught in this whole complex stream of things without seeing and understanding. A big part of doing Vipassana meditation is seeing things clearly. A part of that means seeing things individually, separately, in their own nature, and not being fooled by the whole complex mess. Whenever we contact an object, first of all, there's a physical sense organ contacting the object. There's a physical processing going on. With the sense of sight, it's light waves striking the eye, and it stimulates cells in the eye, the rods and cones, there's nerve endings and so on. With the ear, it's vibrations in the air, sound waves. This is the second of three elements needed for a moment of contact. There has to be an object, there has to be a sense organ, and the third is sense consciousness. It's the mental awareness of the stimulus. This is the first immediate experience. With the sense of sight, it's color and shape. With sound, it's amplitude and frequency, loudness and the pitch. And that's all it is at that point. Then perception takes over, sanya, the quality of perception, which identifies the object. It parses the information that consciousness has experienced, the color and shape, and recognizes, this is a flower, this is a bird, this is a moment of perception. And it's separate from the sense consciousness of seeing. It's another layer on top of it. And then there arises in the mind, subsequent to that, vedana, feeling. The reaction of the mind is automatically to classify the object as being pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This is an automatic, immediate response that follows on after perception. And it is colored by perception. And from there, if the object has been one that's at all engaging to the mind, if it's not, if it's something very trivial, the mind can just stop at that point and go on to the next object. But if it's at all engaging to the mind, then various other processes set in course, and it can go in any number of directions. But there's the thinking mind, sankharas can arise in the mind, thinking about the object, comparing it to other objects of that class one has seen, experienced in the past, or desire can arise in the mind, craving, and this is what sets off the dependent origination. The reaction that comes after the feeling tone is pleasant, one craves the object. If it's unpleasant, one craves to be rid of it. And there can be sensations, feelings in the body that can accompany various complex of things. One can feel a tightness or a warmth or any number of bodily reactions. In the ordinary, the untrained mind, this is all just one big soup, one big alphabet soup of stuff. Just caught in a web of our own mental processing. When we do the meditation, we first of all simplify the externals as far as it's possible to do. You sit in a quiet place with your eyes closed, you sit still. So you're not being bombarded with sense impressions. And when one arises, whether it's internally generated from the mind only or whether it's external, like a sensation in the body or a sound, hopefully that is clear enough, separated from a sensory bombardment. The single object is clear enough that one can begin to parse this process and see the component parts. This is a big part of specificity of noticing. Very important for understanding the nature of the mind, the nature of becoming, the nature of samsara, is to understand how we process information. It's also very liberating when you have some understanding of the process. I want to focus a bit on the term of perception, sanya. In ordinary course of existence, when we're dealing with streams of objects, mental and external, it's virtually impossible to separate consciousness from perception. Even in meditation, it's very difficult. They occur so quickly and paired together so tightly. It's a little easier to do it with the hearing sense. I had one meditator here tell me that I asked him how he was doing in the morning interview, and he said he thought he was really doing well. He was really there with the objects. He says, I heard a bird singing outside the kuti, and I was right there with the bird. And I said, you have a long way to go. It's not, you're missing the point. You did not hear a bird. You heard a high-pitched sound, and you perceived a bird. Your mind imagined a bird. Yeah? This is a little easier to do with hearing. You can hear the sound and notice the lag. There's a moment when you just hear a sound and then you identify it. But the same thing happens with sight, but it's so quick. It's difficult to realize you're not seeing a tree. You're seeing patches of green and brown, and your mind is, through the faculty of perception, is perceiving a tree. One way to get an idea of the way perception works is in some cases where perception is fooled. You can see how perception is separate from consciousness. The classic example they give in some of the old literature is mistaking a rope for a snake. Somebody walking on a road in a path in the forest in the twilight, and there's a piece of rope on the ground, and he sees it out the corner of his eye, and he's sure it's a cobra, and he jumps, and he looks more carefully. It's a snake. It's not a snake. It's a rope. This happens, I think, here when you mistake a tree stump for a bear. I think this is a more common example here. Another kind of example like that is the game that we've probably all played as youngsters, is looking at clouds and seeing shapes and faces and things in the clouds. And if you relax your mind enough, they can become very detailed and elaborate. Or some people do this with flames, looking at a campfire. You have to have the mind in a very relaxed, open mode, and it can see shapes and things from the merest hints of shape. The perception is a whole elaborate scene. So perception has a creative quality. It basically fabricates a world for us out of sense data. And perception, or sanya, is fluid in that it can be changed, or It can be trained or educated. You can develop more refined perceptions. Somebody who has studied geology can look at what someone who hasn't studied geology just sees a pile of rocks. Someone who's studied it can recognize, igneous and schist and whatever, recognize their perception has more refinement in that area. And then if they point it out to you and start pointing out the features, then your perception raises up a notch in that area. You say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, they just look like rocks, but now I can see they're quite different. And perception colors the feeling tone that follows. And this is something that is useful to understand too, that perception has a judgmental quality. We perceive things to be, again, sticking with the visual sense as an easy example, we can perceive things to be ugly or beautiful. And there's an old saying, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and it's quite literally true. Nothing in its own nature is intrinsically beautiful or intrinsically ugly. We have an internalized judgment of an object based on all kinds of things: cultural background, personal preference, perceived utility of the object. We can see it as beautiful or ugly. And this can be changed. You can learn to appreciate beauty in things that you thought were ugly. Or if you have some negative experience, you can begin to see things as ugly that you used to think were beautiful. I like to tell the story, an example of this. I know some of you have heard this before, probably more than once, so I beg your forgiveness, but it'll be new to some of you. When I was studying here with Kema, one of his teaching methods was to get people to flip their perceptions. And I've seen him do it many times, and he was very clever with it. The time that sticks out in my mind was when the two of us were working, cleaning up the yard in the spring. And after working for a couple of hours, we went in the cabin and had a cup of coffee, and we're looking out the window, and I'm thinking of what I'm going to do after coffee break. And I said, I think after coffee break, there was a pile of old firewood stumps that had been left for 2 or 3 years, and they were all mushrooms growing out of them. They were no good anymore. I said, that ugly old pile of poplar, I'm going to cart it away and chuck it in the bush. And Kame says, how can you call that ugly? He said. I mean, look at it. Look at the colors and the shapes and the beauty of those fungus growing out and those elaborate shapes. And he had me tripping out on these pieces of logs, and then it was like an hour and a half later, we're outside working again, and he yells at me, he says, Mike, I thought you were going to get rid of those ugly old stumps. I was ready to leave him there as an objet d'art at that point. And this is something we can deliberately use. We can cultivate appreciation of things. This is another one of my teachers, Ajahn, very important in my life. He had a saying, if you can't get out of it, get into it. And this applies here. If there's some task or duty that you've got to perform, you can encourage yourself to enjoy it, to get into it. Which is the opposite of what people often do. If there's something you don't like, you brood about it, and you concoct another 10 reasons in your mind why this is horrible, instead of trying to look at, what's so good about it? Learn some appreciation. These are all aspects of sanya, perception. And this fluidity of perception is taken to the ultimate in the case of a awakened being, an arahant or a Buddha. So one of the qualities of an arahant is that they can perceive the beautiful in the unbeautiful, or the subha in the asubha in the Pali. They can perceive the beautiful in the unbeautiful and the unbeautiful in the beautiful as they choose. So their perceptions are entirely under control. And related to that, it's also said they are masters of the pathways of the mind. They only think that which they wish to think, and when they do not wish to think, they do not think. They're in complete control of their mental processing. But until you are an arahant, there's a certain degree of wildness, uncontrollability in the mind stream. You have to try and progressively tame the beast, and learn to educate your perceptions. A related quality to this, and kind of overlapping, is the idea of educating the inclinations. And this is one of the qualities that comes with keeping the precepts. Essentially, what you're doing by keeping the precepts initially is you're faking it till you make it. The whole point of keeping precepts is to train the mind. And, for example, not killing the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes here are excellent little teachers, teaching us ahimsa. If you can refrain from killing the mosquitoes, then you gradually educate the inclination. Initially, if people take up that, if people have not been exposed to the idea of the precepts and not harming and killing, the sort of automatic response is to swat at the mosquitoes when they land on you, squash them, without thinking about it. Then they hear about the precepts and they decide they're going to take it up. Then it's a difficult struggle at first. The mosquitoes biting them, and they want to swat it, but they restrain themselves. And it's like they're fighting against their urge. But if they continue with that practice for a while, then it becomes easier and easier, and then in the end, the desire to kill the mosquito is gone. And if you accidentally kill one, you feel a bit bad about it. By keeping the external observance of the precept, one's educated the impulse in the mind, the inclination has been refined. And this works with any of the precepts. It's a process of faking it till you make it. Just go through the motions until you internalize it. And if you can find that fluidity, that educatability of perceptions, it's very liberating. You can free yourself from a lot of incidental suffering. Things that seem ugly or oppressive or unpleasant, you can learn to perceive them in a different way. I'll give you another example of that from my experience when I was first in Thailand. They have these bugs there that are like cicadas. They live in the trees and they make a high-pitched sound, and repetitive kind of high-pitched sound. And at first, when I first heard it, I can remember the first time I heard it, I thought somebody's car alarm was stuck on. It was just like such a strange, almost mechanical kind of sound. And during certain seasons of the year, they start this chorus going every day at sundown, and it goes on for a good half hour or more. This constant chirping of this high-pitched sound from every direction. And for a long time, I found it really irritating. And all these goddamn things are starting up again. There goes my practice for half an hour. I can't do anything now. Until I heard Ajahn, I think it was, he mentioned one day, just kind of casually, that one of the names in Thai for those insects is the trumpet of the Dewas. And after I heard that, my perception, my sanya around that sound changed completely. Now it was like this heavenly chorus starting up. every sundown. It's kind of wonderful. You know? If you can find ways to do that, that you can consciously and deliberately educate your perceptions, you can experience a great deal of happiness that you've missed. Yeah? And you need to understand how this whole process works. Now, it's not just one big lump, and you need to work in the quiet moments when you're meditating at separating the components, so it doesn't become just a big gestalt. An experience of anything is always going to be a stepwise series of processes in the mind that each have their own place and function and weight. And understanding that gives you, first of all, some possibility of intervention, of control. A very important aspect of that is the sequence in the dependent origination, Paticca Samuppada. From sense contact is feeling, and then after feeling comes craving. And it's often said by the teachers that this is the moment that you can break the cycle. Feeling is a resultant factor. After the perception has happened, the feeling occurs as a result. So there's no volition involved. There's no karma made in feeling good or feeling bad or feeling neutral. It's a resultant factor. But then the very next moment is the first moment of the new cycle of becoming, which begins with craving. If you let the mind go into craving, and then the cycle continues. You haven't broken the wheel of becoming. But every time you can notice that feeling and not let it go over into craving, you've had a little moment of bodhi. You've been absolutely clear, and the process is not fed at that moment. Notice pleasant feeling as pleasant feeling, and separate it from then the desire that arises in the mind of wanting more or wanting better. Recognize unpleasant feeling just as painful feeling, and not allow the mind to arise the desire to end it or the desire to escape. Just notice this is what is at this moment. It feels good or it feels bad, or it has no particular feeling tone. And if you just recognize that clearly, see it, and let it stop at that point, then you're not feeding that process of becoming. You're beginning to unravel the knot of becoming. On some level, it's easy to understand. Everybody recognizes that at some level the perception is changeable and fluid. I've already mentioned the saying, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Another one is that something is an acquired taste. I think there's a sense of taste. You can all recognize there are certain foods or taste, flavors that at one time you really craved and now you don't, and vice versa. There are things that tasted strange or odd or didn't like them when you first tasted them, but now you've learned to enjoy them. And this is the same with all the senses. Yeah. I think there may be a partial exception to that rule with the sense of smell, in that the sense of smell is so hardwired directly into the brain. The nerves in the nose go directly to the brain, that there are certain odors that I think we've been genetically programmed to find repulsive to protect ourselves from disease. This is kind of a partial exception to the rule. But in general, there's no sight or sound that is intrinsically pleasant or intrinsically unpleasant. There are things that we enjoy or we dislike through perception. And it's also, on a more kind of philosophical level, it's important to not fall into a kind of naive realism, to understand that our perception is a tool, it's an instrument by which we perceive the world, but like any instrument, it's not 100% reliable. And I've already mentioned a few cases where perception can be fooled, and there's many, many more. There's all kinds of ways in which you can perceive things wrongly. Optical illusions are an example. People make a game out of it. Pictures that can fool the eye, because the perception goes beyond just the light waves of the image and fills in the blanks or makes sense of what it sees in some way. There's a way of understanding this. You could think of the world we actually experience, we live in, is kind of a dream. We dream the world into existence. But the dreaming in waking life is limited or constrained by impulses, data coming from the outer world. There is a universe out there that's sending us streams of data in the shape of light waves, sound waves, chemical molecules in the air, and so on. We can never experience that world immediately, directly. It's always mediated through our senses. And the quality of our sense organs determines the quality of the world that we actually experience, which is the only one that matters. The hypothetical real world out there is something we can never actually know fully, but we can know our own minds. And we can see colors that dogs can't see. And dogs can hear sounds that we can't see. So our perceptual world is different. And for organisms further away from us in the evolutionary tree, the perception is vastly different from our own. Insects see with the compound eye that allows them to detect motion much more refined than we can, but much less refined to perceive shapes. And some insects perceive color beyond what we can perceive. And perception of color in general is an interesting one for the fluidity and educatability of perception. There's an interesting puzzle in ancient languages, ancient Greek and Sanskrit, Pali, and many other ancient languages of that vintage. There's no separate word for blue, the color blue. An example is often cited from Homer in the Odyssey. He uses the simile when they're lost in the ocean. He says, the wine-dark sea. We wouldn't think of comparing the color of the ocean to wine. It seems like completely wrong. Like, why? How can the sea be wine-colored? But there's no separate word for blue. In Pali, there's a word nila, which can mean either blue or black, and it's the same with many languages. So it's a curious question. Did the ancients actually perceive the color blue? It may have been something that was learned by human perception later. Another example I've seen is a color wheel with different shades of green. That they've used, some anthropologists are testing this with different people from different cultures. And in terms of, you can measure the wavelength of the reflected light. There's like I forget how many, it's like 20 or 24 slices of the pie, different shades of green. And most people in Western culture, and I looked at this thing, it's the same for me, I can see like 5, 6 different greens. But there's some people from hunter-gatherer cultures that can perceive 15, 16 more different shades of green in the wheel. Because their perception has, because they depend for their living on perceiving plants in a refined way in the forest. So they've educated their mind to perceiving shades of green that we don't see. We could probably learn that. May have to start as a child. I don't know if an adult could learn that, but it's not something. It's not a biological difference. It's a perceptual difference that they're seeing shades of green we don't see or don't separate. So this is how we make sense of the world. And this is how we navigate the external world, is through our first of all, our sense perception, and then our immediate sense cognition, and then perception that parses the information, that makes sense of it. And it's a naive simplicity to imagine that your perceptions are intrinsically real. If you're healthy and sane and your organs are working well, your perceptions will be a reasonable facsimile of reality that will allow you to function. But they're not intrinsically real. Nothing there is intrinsically real. So it was always kind of a funny question when people want to know, is something real? People want to know, are ghosts real? Are dewas real? Well, define first what you mean by real, and is this human existence real? In what sense is it real? And then maybe you can tackle the questions of other classes of things, whether they're real or not. There's a philosophical debate comes up in mathematics and physics, and it actually has roots in medieval times. The two schools in Europe, the two schools of medieval philosophy, were nominalism and realism. It's something like the Mandelbrot set. Is that real? Is there an intrinsic reality to it or not? Before anybody had ever discovered it, is it real? It's not something that has any physical existence, but it's something that is real in the sense of it's there. You can manipulate it. It's something that makes sense. Or you can take a simpler example, number 3. You just take a whole number. Number 3, is that real? The realists say yes, these ideas, abstracts, are real. They have a reality and some kind of, this Plato goes back to Plato, the idea of the archetypes. The idealists say, no, it's just an idea. It's not. They call nominalists. They say no, it's not. It's not real. It's just a name. Like a lot of these kind of debates in Western philosophy, it becomes sort of meaningless in Buddhism. The Buddhist approach is always a practical one of how do we get out of this mess. And questions about ultimate reality is something the Buddha avoided answering. He didn't want people going there. It's not important. The practical thing is you can't ever experience the ultimately real, if there is such a thing. What you're experiencing is the mind and the changing phenomena of the mind, and that's what we have to live with and deal with. And it's crucial in the first instance to understand it and not just a theoretical way, but to see it directly, immediately. Oh, this is what's happening. My organ is of sight is the eye, is contact and color and shape, and I'm perceiving something, and then I have a feeling about it, and then I make up stories in my head about it. These are all separate phenomena. If you don't see that, you're just helpless. You're just sort of being carried downstream and buffeted by whatever eddies and flotsam and jetsam are banging into you as they pass, and you're not in any control of the situation. So I'll finish it up. The crucial point is to try and understand the nature of perception and not to be fooled by perception. And when you have gained understanding of perception, then you can have some control of perception.